The moment I walked into Lisa's house and saw him, I felt the air change. I wasn't expecting anything special from the evening. A cozy dinner, laughter among friends, and catching up with Lisa as we always did. But there across the room, leaning casually against the kitchen counter, was her son Alex. For a second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. The last time I'd seen Alex, he was a shy teenager, all awkward limbs and hesitant smiles. Now he was something else entirely. He had grown into himself, broad shoulders, sharp features, and a quiet confidence that was impossible to miss. His smile was still warm, but his gaze, oh, that gaze, lingered just a beat too long as our eyes met, sending a spark down my spine. I quickly looked away, pretending to listen to Lisa tell a story about work, but my mind was already spinning. As the evening wore on, I found myself looking at him more than I should. It was harmless, I told myself, just curiosity. But every time I looked, I caught him looking back. A flicker of something unspoken passed between us, and I felt my breath catch. When dinner was over, I offered to help clear the table. Alex joined me in the kitchen and silently handed me the plates. As I reached for one, his fingers brushed against mine. It was nothing, barely a touch, but it lingered in the air between us, palpable and electric. My cheeks burned, and I busied myself with the dishes, hoping he didn't notice. "Thanks for helping," I said, breaking the silence. "No problem," he replied, his voice calm, easy. But when I looked up, I saw his eyes tracing my face, his lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. I excused myself shortly afterwards, my chest tight, and my thoughts a tangle of confusion and exhilaration. By the time I got home, the evening was playing on an endless loop in my mind. Lisa's son. I kept repeating it, as if that label could contain what I had felt, but deep down I knew it was too late. Something had changed. I couldn't stop thinking about him. I had spent the night tossing and turning, every moment of the evening at Lisa's replaying in my mind. His smile, the way his voice dropped when he spoke to me, the brush of his fingers against mine. It all felt etched into my skin. By morning, the memories had burrowed deeper, unwelcome but impossible to ignore. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror, I scolded myself. "You're being ridiculous, Emma," I muttered, running a brush through my hair with more force than necessary. "He's just a child." But even as the words came out of my mouth, I knew they weren't true. Alex wasn't a child, not anymore. Throughout the day, my mind kept drifting back to him. I tried to concentrate, folding laundry, preparing dinner, but every time I caught a quiet moment, I saw his face, those eyes that seemed to hold a secret, that slight curve of his lips, as if he were in on a private joke. What was wrong with me? I was old enough to know better. I had no business entertaining thoughts about him, and yet the fluttering in my chest betrayed me every time I tried to push the feelings aside. It wasn't just the way he looked, though God knows that was part of it. It was the way he made me feel, seen, not the way friends or acquaintances saw me, as Lisa's trusted confidant or the woman with the constant smile. Alex's gaze had felt different, as if he could see past all that, into a part of me I hadn't acknowledged for years. By the time the sun set, casting a golden light through my kitchen window, I was exhausted from fighting myself. I leaned against the counter, the warmth of the setting sun on my face, and let the truth wash over me. I liked the way it made me feel, and that scared me. It had been a restless morning when I decided to go for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The park was quiet, the paths dappled with sunlight filtering through the trees. I'd barely settled into the rhythm of my steps when I spotted him. Alex. He was jogging, his pace leisurely but strong. The sight of him, his broad shoulders, the easy way his body moved, took my breath away. Before I could decide whether to turn away or stay rooted, he noticed me. His face lit up in a way that felt far too intimate, as if I were the only person in the park. "Emma," he came to a halt, his cheeks flushed, his curls damp with sweat. "Alex," I managed, forcing a smile and hoping my pulse wasn't as obvious as it felt. We fell into conversation effortlessly. He asked if I'd like to join him for coffee, and before I could think of a polite excuse, I found myself agreeing. We walked to a nearby cafe, and within minutes, the tension I'd been carrying all morning began to dissipate. He was so easy to talk to, his enthusiasm contagious. He talked about his art, the way he got lost in his work, his voice lighting up with every word. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on me as if my opinion mattered more than anyone else's. "And what about you?" he asked, his voice soft but probing. "What makes you feel alive?" The question took me by surprise. I hesitated, suddenly aware of how long it had been since anyone had asked me anything so personal. "I don't know," I finally said, my voice lower than I had intended. Alex didn't push, didn't fill the silence with platitudes. Instead, he just watched me, his expression a mixture of curiosity and something deeper. When we parted, he smiled, that same faint, knowing curve of his lips. "See you around, Emma," he said, his voice warm. My chest tightened as I watched him leave. This should be simple, but nothing about Alex felt simple anymore. It was a quiet evening when there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I opened it to see Alex standing there, I gasped. "Hi," he said, holding up a book with a shy smile. "Mum thought you might like this. She asked me to bring it by." "Oh," I said, taking the book and stepping aside. "Thanks, come in." I told myself it was polite to invite him in, that it would be a quick visit. But as he followed me into the living room, the air between us felt charged in a way I couldn't ignore. We sat down and I offered him some tea. He accepted, his easy smile never wavering. We didn't talk about anything in particular, films, books, the weather, but every now and then his gaze would linger a moment too long, and I'd feel a blush rise to my cheeks. When the tea was gone and the conversation slowed, Alex got up to leave. He hesitated near the door, shifting slightly before finally speaking. "Emma," he began, his voice lower now. "I need to say something." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "What is it?" He took a breath, his hands slipping into his pockets as if to steady himself. "I think about you all the time," he said quietly. "I know it's not right, I know I shouldn't, but I can't stop." His words fell heavily between us, the room suddenly too small, too warm. I opened my mouth to reply, but no words came out. "I'm sorry if this is too much," he added quickly, his voice tight, "but I couldn't leave without telling you." He looked at me, his expression raw and open. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. "Alex," I finally whispered, but I didn't know what to say. My thoughts were confused, my emotions torn between disbelief and something I dared not name. He walked back to the door, his eyes never leaving mine. "Good night, Emma," he said softly, his voice thick with something I couldn't quite place. And just like that, he was gone. I avoided him. It felt like the only thing I could do after that night. I ignored his texts, no matter how kind or thoughtful. Each one made my chest tighten, pulling me back to a moment I wasn't ready to face. I told myself it was for the best. Distance would keep me sane, logical, but the distance didn't quiet my thoughts. I found myself checking my phone constantly, holding my breath every time it buzzed. When I saw his name, I would sit and stare at the screen, my resolve crumbling inch by inch. One day he sent me a photo, a beautiful sketch of an old, weathered tree. He wrote underneath, "This reminded me of our conversation in the cafe. I hope you're well. I should have deleted it, but I couldn't." I stared at it for minutes, tracing the lines with my eyes as if they were part of him. It was overwhelming, raw, full of emotion. I wanted to thank him, to tell him how moved I was. But I didn't answer. Everywhere I went, I felt his presence, even when he wasn't there. At the market, a man with dark curls like his caught my eye, and my heart leapt. I'd lie awake at night, replaying the way his voice had softened when he said my name. What unsettled me most was how alive it all made me feel. The chaos, the thrill, the pain, things I hadn't felt in years. It frightened me how much I wanted more of it, how much I wanted him. But he was too young, too close, and I should know better. When his next text came, a simple "miss you," I couldn't hold back any longer. My fingers hovered over the keys before I finally replied, "I miss you too." The second I sent it, my heart raced in a way I hadn't expected. Relief, guilt, excitement, all mixed together. His reply came almost immediately. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, knowing I was on the verge of something I couldn't undo, and yet I typed, "Okay." The night felt heavier than usual, the air thick with something I couldn't name. Alex had offered to drive me home after we met in the park. I hesitated, but said yes. The low hum of the car filled the space between us as we drove, neither of us speaking, though I could feel the weight of all that was unspoken. When we pulled up in front of my house, I reached for the door handle, eager to escape the tension that seemed ready to break. "Thanks for the ride," I said softly, my voice barely steady. "Wait," he said, his hand brushing my wrist. I froze. His touch was light, hesitant, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to look at him, and the expression on his face stopped me cold. His eyes were dark, intense, filled with something I couldn't bring myself to name. "Emma," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper, "I can't stop thinking about you." The words hung in the air, and before I could answer, he leaned closer. I should have stopped him, my mind screamed for me to. But when his lips touched mine, soft and tentative, the world outside the car dissolved. It wasn't a kiss filled with urgency or demand. It was searching, his hand moving to cradle my cheek as if he feared I might pull away. I wasn't. His other hand brushed my arm, slow and deliberate, as if testing the limits of what I would allow. My pulse was racing, and I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin as he deepened the kiss, his lips exploring mine with a quiet reverence that made me tremble. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless. "We can't," I whispered, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Tell me you don't feel the same," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. I couldn't. My silence answered for me. He leaned in again, his lips finding mine as my resolve crumbled completely. For the first time in years, I let myself go. After that night, I told myself it couldn't happen again. It wasn't just the guilt that ate at me, though it clawed at my chest every time I thought of his face, his touch. It was the fear of what would happen if I let myself fall any further. He deserved someone his own age, someone whose life wasn't tangled up in complications. I could barely untangle myself. But Alex had other ideas. The first time I opened my door to find a small bouquet of wildflowers on the porch, my heart sank and soared at the same time. The note was simple: "For the way you brighten everything." I should have thrown it away, told him to stop. Instead, I placed the flowers in a vase on the kitchen counter, their presence both comforting and damning. When he texted again, "I can't stop thinking about you. Let me see you," I left it unanswered. But his words lingered. Each message he sent drew me closer to the edge, even as I tried to pull back. One morning, as I stood by the window sipping coffee, I saw him walking up the street. My heart stuttered. He wasn't going anywhere in particular, just walking, his hands in his pockets, his head tilted as if lost in thought. The way he moved was so familiar now, so painfully like him. Before I knew it, I was opening the door. "Alex," I called softly. He looked up, and the smile that spread across his face was unguarded, filled with a joy that took my breath away. He walked towards me, and before I could change my mind, I stepped aside to let him in. We talked for hours that day. It felt like breathing after holding my breath for far too long. He listened as he always did, with an intensity that made me feel as if the rest of the world had faded away. When he reached out, his fingers brushing mine, I didn't pull away. He didn't push. He didn't have to. His insistence wasn't forceful. It was something quieter, more powerful, and I was powerless to resist. "This has to stop, Alex," I said, my voice shaking as I stood at the window, refusing to face him. The words felt like they were being carved out of me, each one heavier than the last. He was silent behind me. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the tension in the air thick enough to make my chest ache. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, even, but there was a sharpness to it that cut right through me. "Why?" he asked simply. I turned and finally met his eyes. They held the same intensity that always took my breath away, but now they were clouded with pain. "Because it's wrong," I whispered. "Because you're young and I'm—" "You're what?" he interrupted, coming closer. "Older? Is that it? Is that what you're afraid of?" I didn't know how to answer him. Every excuse I'd rehearsed in my head felt flimsy under his gaze. "You deserve more, Alex. You deserve someone who can give you a future." He shook his head, his lips curving into a bitter smile. "And what if I don't want anyone else? What if I don't care about the future? What if I just want you?" His words hit me like a punch in the gut. I turned away, desperately trying to find the strength to hold on. "It doesn't matter," I said, my voice breaking. Whatever this is, it can't go on. I'm sorry." I heard him exhale sharply, a sound of frustration and disbelief. For a moment, I thought he was going to argue again, but instead I felt his presence behind me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from him. "If you really want me to go," he said softly, his voice like a whisper against my skin, "just say so. Tell me to go and I will." The words caught in my throat. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The truth was, I didn't want him to leave. I never did, but I couldn't bring myself to admit it. Not yet. Laser's voice was soft, but her words hit me like a stone. "Have you noticed how distracted Alex has been lately?" she asked one morning over coffee. "I mean, he's always been focused, but now I don't know, he seems distant. And he's been disappearing for hours." I stirred my coffee, keeping my face as neutral as possible. "Maybe he's just busy. You said he was working on a new project, right?" Lisa sighed and leaned back in her chair. "I suppose, but it feels like something else. I asked him about it and he brushed me off. It's not like him." I felt my pulse quicken, guilt tightening around my chest like a vice. I forced a small smile. "I'm sure he's fine, Lisa. He's just sorting things out." But as she went on, talking about his recent behavior, I couldn't concentrate. All I could think about was Alex, his stubbornness, the way he looked at me as if nothing else in the world mattered. The weight of what we'd done, what we were still doing, pressed down on me harder than ever. That evening, as the sun sank low and shadows stretched across the walls, there was a knock at my door. I knew who it was before I opened it. "Emma," Alex said quietly, his eyes searching mine. "You shouldn't be here," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. I couldn't stay away. There was a desperation in his tone that broke something inside me. I turned away, wrapping my arms around myself as if that would keep him out. "It's tearing me apart," I whispered. "It's tearing me apart too," he replied, his voice cracking. And as I looked at him, I saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the pain he wasn't trying to hide. "Please don't shut me out," he said, coming closer. I should have told him to leave, but instead I let him pull me into his arms. His warmth, his strength. It was too much and not enough at the same time. I knew I was lost again. The decision came to me in the silence of the night as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I had to let him go. I wasn't sure if it was courage or sheer exhaustion that was driving me, but the next morning I rang Alex and asked him to meet me. When he arrived, there was no lightness in his step, no easy smile. He knew. He always seemed to know. We sat on the couch, the silence between us heavy with all we couldn't say. I'd rehearsed the words, but now, with him sitting so close, they wouldn't come. Instead, I looked at his hands, resting on his knees, strong and steady. How often had they held me with such care? Finally, I took a breath. Alex, this has to stop. My voice trembled, betraying me. His head snapped up, and his eyes locked with mine. Emma, don't do this. Don't push me away. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I blinked them back. This isn't about pushing you away. It's about doing what's right for both of us. This isn't fair to you. You are everything, he said fiercely, his voice raw. I looked away, unable to bear the intensity in his gaze. I can't be. Not in the way you need, Alex. It's not sustainable. It's not forever, and I can't keep pretending it is. He stood up abruptly and paced the room, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Why do you get to decide this? Why does it have to be about what's right instead of what we feel? I stood too, instinctively reaching out, my fingers brushing his arm. Because I care about you, and because if we go on, this will hurt more than it already does. He stopped, his shoulders slumping as if the fight had drained out of him. When he turned back to me, his face was etched with pain. I'll never regret this, not 1 second of it. His words broke something inside me, and for a moment I thought I might break, but I couldn't. I had to stand firm. I'll never regret it either, I said quietly. He nodded, his jaw set, and without another word he turned and walked out the door. As it closed behind him, the silence that followed was deafening. I sank into the couch, the pain in my chest unbearable. But beneath the pain there was something else, a faint flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. He had awakened me, and for that I would always be grateful. Days turned into weeks, and though the pain of his absence remained, so did the spark he left behind. I began to see the world differently, colours brighter, moments sharper. Alex had reminded me of what it was like to be alive, to be seen. And while he was gone, the part of me he had awakened was here to stay, leading me forward, one quiet step at a time. Thank you for being with me to the end. Like and subscribe to I'll Never Regret It Either, I said quietly. He nodded, his jaw set, and without another word he turned and walked out the door. As it closed behind him, the silence that followed was deafening. I sank into the couch, the pain in my chest unbearable. But beneath the pain, there was something else. A faint flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. He had awakened me, and for that I would always be grateful. Days turned into weeks, and though the pain of his absence remained, so did the spark he left behind. I began to see the world differently, colours brighter, moments sharper. Alex had reminded me of what it was like to be alive, to be seen. And while he was gone, the part of me he had awakened was here to stay, leading me forward, one quiet step at a time. Thank you for being with me to the end. Like and subscribe to Betrayal Stories.